I'm able to grow about 20 times greater yield per acre than any other kind of gear that's operated manually because Shellevators can have multiple layers that occupy the entire water column. So about 1 meter of water, I can grow probably 3 to 5 million oysters, whereas normally you'd only
That's
be
incredible.
growing 1 or 200,000.
Welcome to Oyster-ology, a podcast about oysters, aquaculture, and everything from spat to shuck. I'm your host, Kevin Cox. My guest this week is Dr. Andy DePaola, an oyster farmer, marine biologist, and inventor from the Gulf Coast of Alabama. In addition to being one of the world's foremost experts on oyster disease, Andy is an inventor who is leading the charge of large-scale oyster farming with an extraordinary invention that could transform the way we produce oysters. He calls it the Shellevator, a submersible oyster-growing watercraft with lift tanks that utilized compressed air to farm oysters in the complete water column from bottom to surface. Andy explains the concept to me, how the invention works, and what it can mean not just for localized oyster farming, but as a method of feeding mass populations around the world. As our riveting conversation went on, I came to see Andy as sort of a mad scientist, whose ideas are so big that they made my head spin. And when I say big ideas, I mean change the world big. That's because he sees his practical inventions as just the start of his greater plan to create a large-scale new industry for young people to basically implement a way to feed the planet in the future. And just when I thought Andy was done, he went on to describe another completely logical invention of his, designed to grow oyster castles while at the same time protecting and restoring coastal shorelines and reducing wave energy as the oceans rise. It's all about the beauty of simplicity blended with serious science and homegrown inventions that make you realize that Andy's ideas can really work. And that realization is absolutely thrilling. So tussle up your hair and slip on your mad scientist goggles and lab coat to enter the future of oystering, where we discuss things like increasing today's oyster farming yield by 20-fold, exploding prototypes, oil tankers as oyster farms, the connection between reefer and oysters, enhancing global food security, sequestering carbon, one-person oyster farming made easy, and a new industry that can end up changing the world with my guest and remarkable farmer, biologist, inventor, and mad scientist, Andy DePaola. Hey, Andy, thank you so much for being on Oyster-ology. I'm really excited to have you here. You know, you're a fascinating guy. You're an oysterman, a scientist, a consultant, an inventor. You kind of do it all. Where are you located right now?
So I've been on Mobile Bay. The town is Coden, Alabama. It's probably one of the least educated, poorest zip codes, and it used to have the most oyster processing plants of any zip code in the country, but it takes on part of the southwest shore of Mobile Bay, and then it also connects part of the northern shore of the Mississippi Sound, and it borders Bayou Battery of Forrest Gump fame.
So I'm picturing kind of right past Florida border into Alabama somewhere down on the Gulf, right?
We would probably be closer to the Mississippi border. So I'm on the west side of Mobile Bay. And on the east side, it's more like the panhandle of Florida and Isa with sugar, sand beaches, and clear water. But Mobile Bay is the third largest flow in the country. So we have a lot of rain that falls through the state of Alabama. So we have very dynamic salinity, probably more so than any place I know about. Right now, my salinity here at the house may be 3 parts per thousand, but I can go out about 12 miles and it'll be 35 parts per thousand. But the fresh water really hugs the western side of the bay and then kind of goes out in the Gulf or goes west toward Mississippi and the Mississippi Sound.
So tell me a little bit about your farm. Your farm is DP's Oysters. Now, is that the one that's at the house or the one further out on the island?
So DP's Oyster has 4 locations right now. We have one in Mobile Bay at my house. I have 2 more in part of the Mississippi Sound called Portersville Bay. One of those is a neighbor oysterman who has a longer pier than me and has like a foot deeper water, which is critical for me right now. I just got my offshore lease where I have deep water, but my water runs between 2 and 3 feet. And it's very hard to operate Shellevators in that shallow water. The oysters will spend a lot of time in the air and grow slower, and sometimes it is rough. And then I have another location in Grand Bay, Alabama. The Labattria High School operates about a 50-acre park there, and they lease out 2-acre portions. And there's probably a dozen. That's where most of the farming in Alabama occurs.
So in all of the 4 different locations, how many acres are you farming right now?
I'm kind of wadding on a neighbor's stuff. He has a couple of acres. I have 4 Shellevators there, so I probably have less than a 20th of an acre that I occupy on his farm. But I have about a 250,000 oysters there. I have 1 acre here in Mobile Bay, another acre at my farm in Portersville, and 2 acres. So I'm paying for 4 acres right now.
Are these grown primarily for singles or half-shell consumption, or are they grown more for canning?
So pretty much everybody that's farming oysters is growing for the half-shell market. Those are bringing in a lot more money than the shucking oysters. But eventually, if we can
Right.
bring the prices down, I hope to be growing for restoration and for the shucking market, because I'm able to grow about 20 times greater yield per acre than any other kind of gear that's operated manually, because the Shellevators can have multiple layers that occupy the entire water column. So I can grow probably up to in about 1 meter of water. I can grow probably 3 to 5 million oysters, whereas normally you'd only
That's
be
incredible.
growing 1 or 200,000. Is what other people have floating gear, and they're growing on a single plane, whereas I'm growing 3 dimensionally.
You're talking about the Shellevator. So tell me what the Shellevator is. Help our listeners understand and kind of visualize what this thing is.
It's a submersible oyster watercraft. It uses compressed air, and it consists of lift tanks that are mounted under a frame. And on the frame, you put your stacks of oyster gear that's attached to the frame. And when you want to bring this thing up from the bottom, we use a small compressor that's about the size of a 6-pack, and it can transport about 80 cubic feet a minute into the air inlet, which forces the water out of the exhaust port at the bottom. And so within just a few minutes, you could lift tons and tons of oysters. And it's very efficient. It's a 1,200-watt blower that they use on hydro hoist boat lifts. And it's very inexpensive, under $200. And you can lift a Shellevator more than 10 times on a kilowatt. So in most places, that brings that up to around 1 penny per raising, which is incredible to raise tons of stuff for just a penny.
Right. So basically, what you're talking about is some sort of platform, whether it's just a barge or pontoon, with air bladders
Lift tanks.
underneath it, lift tanks, right? And then the gear that you would mount on top of that platform might be cages, condos, whatever. So as many oysters as will fit on that platform, you can raise easily and incredibly inexpensively so that they can then be attended to.
When I was thinking about this, I was retiring from FDA in 2015, and I had already started growing oysters on my pier in Mobile Bay.
And you were with FDA for 37 years, right?
Right. I graduated from North Carolina State with a master's degree in 1978, and my first job was about 2 blocks from the Capitol, and that's where FDA had all their offices. I didn't really want to be there. They had wanted to hire me as a microbiologist, and the position was in Dauphin Island, Alabama, but the Federal Registry for Microbiology closed, so they brought me on as a food technologist. But the only position they had was at their headquarters in DC. So I spent 3 months in September and worked there. And it was really great because, well, shoot, in my first week, there was a cholera outbreak associated with blue crabs in Louisiana, which when I got to work for FDA, I was in the molluscan shellfish branch. And it was hammered into my head that, these were oyster, clams, and mussels. That's all I needed to worry about. A couple of days later, I was on a plane to Dauphin Island, Alabama, and I was all of a sudden became the lead on a Gulf Coast survey of oysters from mostly from Louisiana, 4 different sites.
So you've described the Shellevator and how it works. How do you employ the Shellevator on your farms? And also, I'm curious to understand the difference in how you handle oysters and the volume of oysters you can handle with a Shellevator versus without a Shellevator.
So when I first, was considering retirement in 2015, and Bill Walton, he came down from Massachusetts, and now he's up at Vims, but he came down here, and the industry was just starting. And I went out with him, and he was flipping these floating oyster grows. Basically, there's 2 floats on those, and they suspend cages that have 6 bays, all 6 bags, and they're like 36 by 18 bags and 3 or 4 inches tall. You get in the water and you flip them so the floats are, instead of being on the top, they're on the bottom and the oysters are on the top. Yeah, I thought, holy crap, that's a lot more work than an old man like me wants to do. So for years, I thought about submersibles. And I had a friend of mine who was an architect and engineer from Surf City, North Carolina, Gary Sunderland. So he was a retired architect and, very, very capable, had a degree in engineering. And I told him I wanted to use compressed air. So he and I worked together for a few years, and we built a couple of prototypes. One was a barge type. Another one was made out of 1 foot diameter PVC pipes, which we joined together like pontoons. And
Mm-hmm.
a couple of things that I really had not considered was that now you have ability to, in a few minutes, to lift these things up with not even lifting a finger except to turn a switch. And now you could move these things with the PVC one. My wife could take the kayak out and actually paddle it out and move it. So this mobility, this seemed to be something particularly where I was at, and I was having these mass mortality events. I could escape harm. So another
Mm-hmm.
feature that I quickly realized that these things in the submerged position, when we had hurricanes, and we've had a lot of them here since I first put them in the water in 2017. Matter of fact, I've lost my pier 7 times. The original Shellevators, they sit on the bottom, out of the wave energy, out of the debris field, and they're immovable objects. And I have not lost an oyster or a Shellevator during a hurricane. And hurricanes have devastated North Carolina and Florida and Louisiana. And, you're not a sitting duck with floating gear, you're a dead duck. People have lost their entire farms. You see these floating gear up in trees. And so, the remedy is to go out there and flood your pontoons. But yes, if you got 1 million oysters, you got 1,000 of these things. And it takes like over 5 minutes. So you have to get out there 5 or 6 days in advance because you can only sink a few hundred a day. And even then, they weigh maybe 200 pounds. When I have a Shellevator, I can put up to 10 tons of, gear on it, gear plus oysters, which is,
That's
like 100,000 oysters. It's a whole farm on a boat.
So you can just lower the Shellevator all the way down to the bottom. The oysters sit down there below most of the wave energy during a big storm.
And usually when you get a storm in, you'll get a surge of water, it could be 2 or 3 or 4 feet or 10 or 20 feet. But not only are they below that, but they're not on the bottom. The lift tanks are underneath them, and the lift tanks are holding them off the bottom. When you sink floating gear, if it flips over and that cage the floats are on the top, those things will bury, and you can't get them out.
Yep.
And when they bury, it kills all their oysters. So,
Right.
sometimes what'll happen is these pontoons will settle down like a half a foot. So you have to introduce some compressed air. They don't come up immediately. But, if you can get a little bit compressed air over, a few hours, they'll work their way out of the mud. It depends on what kind of bottom type it is, and then you can flush them out, and they're good to go. They save the labor from, accessing your oysters where you're desiccating. That was the main thing that we do. We get such barnacle growth down here that the manual gear, any kind of mesh gear has to be desiccated weekly. If you don't desiccate weekly down here, you'll get a biofilm within 10 days, and that'll be populated with hard biofouling organisms like rib mussels and barnacles. And once they get established, you can't, desiccate and kill them anymore. You're going to have to pressure wash. They clog your mesh up,
I
so you
see.
don't get flow through your gear. They're gnarly. They make it heavy. They're dangerous to handle. And they just create a lot of work. So the best thing to do is to dry these things out regularly. So the problem I've had with Shellevators is that it takes forever to get permits. You can get a
Mm,
permit for under your pier or next to your pier without a Army Corps of Engineer, a nationwide 48 permit, just through the state, which you can get in a few weeks. But the problem is my pier only has 2 or 3 feet of water, so the Shellevator, the oysters are out of the water, and particularly the top shelves. Sometimes I'll have 5 shelves, and they'll be separated from
oh, yeah.
5 or 6 inches. So those top shelves,
Hmm.
may only be submerged a few hours a day, and then they're up in the wave energy. But really, what I found out by having them in the shallow water is that these things don't have to be tumbled. That the waves do it every
Right,
second.
because
They
there's so
they
much
they
wave
tumble
energy.
them,
Yeah.
and these oysters, they're smooth as a baby's butt. They'll sculpt it. They'll have the lid instead of being flat, they'll look like you'll have 2, bottoms on it, and there will not be a speck of, mud or there'll be no barnacles on the bags, and that's without even raising them up and down. So when we do that, like the 5 shelves, I'll come out every month or 6 weeks and take the bottom shelf out and the top shelf and rotate those, which for 180 bags I can do. And, I have a helper that we can do that in a little over an hour. But now I can move them out to 4 or 5 feet of water where they'll stay submerged all the time and they'll grow faster out there. And then when I need to, polish them up, I can bring them back to my pier and, wait for kind of a choppy day. And, within 2 or 3 days, they're reconditioned. So we spend a lot of time people using manual gear desiccating. And about every month or two, they have to do a density reduction and they tumble and grade. Well, that can take, for what I'm doing, it can take a very long time and days, which it takes me a few minutes to do that. I can tilt it to one side and all the oysters by gravity will roll down to the other side. So there's other ways to tumble
Huh.
in. So each one of my bags holds about 400 or 500 market size oysters. They may hold 50,000 seed. Most of the
Yeah.
people with baskets have about 100 and with bags have about 200. So not only am I able to grow more bags, I actually have to grow in higher density so the waves don't roll them around too much. So most people stock at
Yeah.
a quarter of a bag. I stock at a half a bag, and then I'll harvest it from 2/3 to 3/4, where I'll do a density reduction.
You'll still need to pull bags and sort them and cull them out to get the different sizes from time to time, though. Is that right?
Usually I wait until, all the oysters have gotten to a certain size. So, I want to increase the mesh size because I get better flow and everything. And sometimes I'll do
Hmm.
some sorting there, but usually I sort at harvest
I
and
see.
not so much in between.
What I find amazing is the concept. So when I've seen these floating gear like you described earlier, then you got to flip them and that sort of thing. Yeah, that's a hell of a lot of work. But also, what I've noticed is it's usually only two levels, the baskets.
Two
And
levels
you're
is
talking
mostly.
about being able to do 5 or 6 or even more levels with the Shellevator, right?
So in 1 meter of water, which is where I have my neighbor's pier has about 1 meter of water in it on an average tide. I have a barge style that's 32 feet long and 10 feet wide and 1 foot thick. And I have 5 levels at 5.5 inches on each one of them, which is an inch and a half or 2 inches more than what you would get in the little wire. And these are very sturdy cages that will last a lifetime, I think. For entry, right now, each elevator I make is a new design, new features, it's custom built. It's experimental, and sometimes the last one I built exploded. And
How did that happen?
well, it's a pressurized vessel. And we had some weld seams that were on the top. And when you introduce air, even though it's about only 1 pound per square inch, if you got something 12 foot, that's 144 by 12, or you got 10,000 pounds of
Hmm.
internal pressure there. And if the exhaust gets a little bit plugged up from sinking in the mud, maybe you go from 1 pound up to almost 2 pounds per square inch. But if you got pontoons, those are much more resilient. But then you have to have deeper water because the pontoons are like 2 feet in diameter. Where I've had these barges from 8 inches to 12 inches thick. But if you really wanted to add capacity, you'd make them 2 or 3 foot thick, and then you'd move them out to 8 feet of water. So then instead of growing 5 million per acre, I could grow more than 10 million per acre. So
That's remarkable.
just think
Yeah.
of a
So
chicken house. Purdue and them, they built these climate controlled houses, but then they started stacking these cages vertically. So in a very small footprint, they were able to grow millions of chickens in climate controlled automatic feeding. So one person, could grow 1 million chickens. So now it became the cheapest protein on earth. So, a Shellevator is basically a barge or some kind of lift vessel system that, you can
right.
stack these things up and you can grow the whole water column in a single season. It's vertical. Yeah. So that's probably the thing that I hadn't really thought about. You have a pier, you don't even have to have a boat to go out there and get the
Right.
stuff. And, a family with a pier a couple hundred feet long could, make several $100,000 a year. They're getting, current prices, which for me is 55 cents an oyster, which is incredible because these oysters only, weigh a tenth of a pound each. So I get
Yeah.
$5.50 a pound for live oysters. But on a Shellevator, each one of those bags I have is gaining about a half a pound a day. So the big one that has 180 bags is growing 90 pounds a day. So, I'm making like hundreds of dollars a day. I don't make any money till I sell the oyster,
Right.
obviously, but they're
Sure.
growing at that
Sure.
rate. Yeah.
You've created this Shellevator, which now enables an oyster farmer to double, triple, even quadruple or more.
It's literally a 10-20 fold. It's an order of magnitude. It's basically a quantum leap of
Mm,
production. And that's what we're going to need to do to feed the planet. And the thing is, in the Gulf of Mexico, the growing season is very, very long. They grow all year round. So you can go from a seed to a market oyster in as little as 5 months. Whereas in Maine, it might take 3 years. So
right.
the Mississippi Sound, where we're at, it's basically the fertile crescent of the planet. That 10-mile wide sound that goes almost 100 miles from Dolphin Island Bridge all the way to Louisiana, the whole coast of Alabama and Mississippi, the western coast. And the salinities and everything, they're a little bit higher when you go a little bit south. So we could grow a gigaton of oysters, or we could actually grow like 4 gigatons and sequester 1 gigaton of carbon by having Shellevators throughout the Mississippi Sound.
I'm really glad you mentioned carbon because that's another thing that is incredible about this. When you've created this mechanism that enables you to grow so many more oysters in the same footprint, you're also having a tremendous impact on the carbon removal from the water, the nitrogen removal, the filtering and cleaning of the water because you've got so many more oysters doing all of that work. That's amazing.
Yeah, this is not theoretically. On my neighbor's pier right now, we have 4 Shellevators that are like literally only 3 feet apart, and they have an aisle.
Wow.
So they're
Right.
taking up not even a 20th of an acre. They grow at almost equal rate all the way through that water column. So it's shocking. I don't
Now,
think anybody's ever produced food at that kind of density. You're doing it at scale, which to do 1,000 tons, we would need 300 Shellevators like I have, our biggest ones. And they would do about 3 tons a year, which is about 12 tons of oysters or about 88,000 oysters per ton of carbon. So the carbon that's sequestered is inorganic carbon that forms the calcium carbonate shell. And calcifiers are part of the long-term storage of carbon. The other is fossil fuels. So if you look at the cliffs of Dover, these were single cell organisms that settled over millennia to form this. They're just passively sequestering carbon. And it's very stable in the shell. We have shell mounds
Wow.
in Alabama, Dolphin Island, that are over 10,000 years old. And the shells are still just like they were.
Tell the listeners a little bit about X Prize, because this was a great honor, recognizing the power of the Shellevator, and that they saw you as one of the 100 top innovations for carbon removal. Is that right?
Well, yeah, this is a planetary, a whole world competition.
Right.
There were 30 or 40 countries that entered. 25 countries actually made the top 100, and this is well over 1,000 teams that actually made it to the finals. There were more teams
Wow.
in the beginning. I think in Texas there were like 1,000 teams. So the human population, 7 billion plus, is
Mhm.
emitting, I think, around 37 gigatons, billion tons, 37 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually. If we were to produce a gigaton of oysters, which I can do on Shellevators, we would feed the planet 36 oysters a day, every human. But we would still need 36 times that amount just to keep pace with our emissions. And we won't do that with oysters alone. But a lot of these other things are going to take inventions that haven't been invented yet. And if you do them,
Yeah.
they're going to cost a lot of money. So basically, for me to grow oysters, is the carbon sequestration is free. I'm getting the $1.50 a pound on selling them for food. So
Yeah.
to get the 1,000 tons, I would need 300 Shellevators, like I have currently operating, and I could do that on my 3 acre farm. I can put about 100 per acre.
Incredible.
Uh, So we have something we call the megavator, and basically, as we wean ourselves off of fossil fuel, we have all these barges that transport fuel all around. And these things are 300 feet long and 120 wide, and they're 8, 10 feet tall. And, we will repurpose these and make them into Shellevators, megavators. So each one of these
Huh.
would need about 20 foot of water to submerge, but you'd be growing, instead of 1 meter, you'd be growing a lot higher. And you could go out to 20 or 30 foot of water and grow 1,000 tons per megavator per year. So you would need 1,000 megavators to do a megaton. So, we would have those in 1,000 places. We'd have a gigaton, and that's where we feed the whole world. So that's a
You're
million
thinking big,
megavators.
and I love that.
Yeah. But in order to get the gigaton, our solution moved away from Shellevators, because Shellevators are for harvesting oysters. And they have the lowest carbon footprint of any other food that we produce on the planet. So you would be saving that many
Wow.
orders of magnitude over other animal protein, which you have to feed and with stuff like this. But what I want to do is to grow reefs, moving oyster restoration out of the Stone Age with 3D reefs. So I've proven with the Shellevator that in a matter of a season, you can grow from the surface to the bottom. And what I am proposing to do is to have something that will resemble a chia plant. Are you familiar with those? These are like
Oh, yes.
nest
The chia.
structures that they glue seeds to, and you wet them, and when they
Right.
germinate, they grow out sprouts that look like hair, and they fill out that mesh. So what I want to do is to take a lightweight matrix. I've taken a crab trap wire, this chicken wire that's coated, basically, and we make crab traps
Mm.
out of them. I can buy a 150-foot roll of this crab trap wire for $100. And it's like 2 feet
Hmm.
high and not 2 feet across. It'll fit inside a 55-gallon drum. And then what I do is I put like maybe 100,000 eyed larvae, and eyed larvae are 21 days after fertilization. And when they get to that stage, within a few days, they're going to settle and attach to something. So in this case, they settled it and attached to that mesh crab wire. And they did that for several days in a static recirculating system with aeration, where I fed them algal paste. I began flowing water filtered through a plankton net to keep the zooplankton for a couple of weeks. And I could, see that there was a really good set on the wire. So at that point, the wire probably weighed 30, 40 pounds, a roll of it. I tied it with a rope,
Hmm.
suspended it from a pier. And I came back in October after about 12, 14 weeks. And that thing was a fused structure. The oysters had fused with each other,
Really?
and it probably must have weighed a couple hundred pounds. I like to never got it out of the water. And when I unwound it, the oysters were growing between the wire mesh, and I ended up probably killing most of them. But what popped off, I put in baskets, and I was shocked about how well they grew in the
Wow.
baskets. But there were some live ones left on the wire, so I stretched them out between my pier pilings, like 30 or 40 feet there. But then other ones, I made little circles around the pilings. So it was interesting. After a couple of weeks, the ones I had stretched out and had baby oysters on them, the sheep's head or crabs or something to come by and eaten all of them. But the ones that are around the
Right.
piling, they were, they couldn't get to the inside, and those lived until about
Really?
January, and then we had a freeze and they died. So, I plan to
Yeah.
repeat that this spring. So the cool thing about the crab trap wire is that when you unwind it, it has a memory where it's been wound up in a tight spiral, and it forms a natural spiral because of the memory. And so you cut off like a 30-foot piece, and you can make 4 or 5 layers that are like 6 inches apart, or you could have them at different distances. You put a cast net over it, and now you've got something that's going to grow in a single season all the way through the water column. I put them in about 2 foot of water. It's going to grow up 2 foot and be like 6 feet across, and it'll sequester a ton of carbon passively. But the cool thing
Yeah.
about these is that if you were going to, put oyster on spat or on rocks, like, people normally do restoration, it would take you hundreds of maybe 1,000 years to grow up 2 or 3 foot through the water column. And now you can do it in a single season. And not only that, you've got all these oysters that, as the oysters are growing, they secrete pseudofeces and they excrete feces, which are very high in organic
Hmm.
carbon. And it'll settle in the interstitial spaces. And as the oysters in the bottom become covered with it, they'll die and they'll gape. And their gaping shell will fill up with organic carbon and that will compress.
Right.
And, only the outside of that structure will actually be alive after several years. But now you could plant
Hmm.
grass on top of it, like spartina or seagrass. So you could restore marshes and you could sprig it in between the mesh. So where the roots are going to not wash out from the tides, it'll be an intertidal. I haven't trademarked it. I probably will. We call these reefers because these, unlike your father's reefer, which he rolled, these you unroll into a reefer, which becomes a three-dimensional freestanding. You can just stake it down with like bamboo or wooden stakes. It has no water resistance while the oysters are small, but as they grow and they become heavy, then it has the weight so that it'll become a permanent structure that will stay put.
And I guess it'll drop down in the mud too a little bit and be even more secured as it gets heavier
Yes,
and
it, it,
heavier.
it will. It will
So you're creating basically pilings
you're creating
of
islands that
yeah,
that grow
island.
vertically. That for a few $100s, not even that much. So I can make like 5 or 6 reefers from a roll of crab trap wire that costs $100. So here we go, $20, and then maybe $50 worth of eyed larvae. And now you're sequestering
Hmm.
a ton of carbon passively. You don't have to do any work. You just let it sit there and grow. If we want to go out and make a reef, we have to go up the river 300 or 400 miles and get granite boulders, bring them back with all that carbon footprint to push them off with heavy equipment. Hopes that something colonizes it. Usually is barnacles, not oysters. And there are fish attraction devices and stuff like that. But they're not really filtering water and doing the work that these reefers will be doing with tens of thousands of oysters on them.
It sounds to me like you could almost use them to form bulkheads or certainly shorelines that are going to grow naturally. So, in addition to cleaning the water and doing all of the benefits that having all those oysters do, you're also creating a new environment. And you're shoring up the shoreline and probably reducing a lot of the wave energy in the process, right?
And so as the sea level rises, you can grow them up higher toward the surface to
Hmm.
to protect against sea level rise. But to me, the low hanging fruit is working right along the coastline and protecting your shoreline and attract. I love to fish off my pier. These oysters attract so many red drum, flounder, and everything. So
Yeah.
it's a very integrated situation where I'm growing oysters, which I love to eat, and you know, what I want to do is establish an economy where young people can become business people. I don't want to have labor. I want to create businesses and that,
Right.
people can go out and operate Shellevators. They'll have factories where we build them. We'll have operators. We'll have venture capital. And somehow or another, like Uber does, we'll figure out these things will eventually probably be sold, auctioned off on the internet. So what I'd like to do is integrate the final user, the consumer, and it could be a restaurant or it could actually be where they can invest in Shellevators ahead of time for oysters that they'll receive later and create
Yeah.
a new economy that
S-
works for people.
What kind of barrier to entries would there be for a farmer? What does it cost to get one of your more typical Shellevators for a small to medium oyster farm?
Right now, too much. What I have to do is to come up with
Hmm.
a way to mass produce these things. And I'm thinking several different options. I'm going to be talking to a venture capital company that got my invention off the X Prize announcement. And but
Right.
I'd like to make something like a sit on top kayak that you
Yeah.
could connect together with beams, and you can
Hmm.
make them different thicknesses. You might make them,
Right.
6 or 8 or 12 inches tall, and then you could put a foot or 2 of gear, and you might have 10 or 20,000 oysters, which would feed your family. Maybe if you had multiple ones, then you could have a living. But some that it would ultimately be
Yep.
like maybe 30 feet long and 10 feet wide that would hold 10 tons.
Hmm.
And those would be the smaller versions. Right now, for me to build one out of aluminum, it's over $20,000. It holds like 120 bags. So that comes up
Right.
to a lot more than the $50 a bag that you can get with an oyster grower.
Sure.
But I think if
Right.
we could mass produce these things and make a new gear that's not custom built, that's stackable and transportable and modular, that you can connect them together, I think that I could bring my price down pretty even with what other floating gear costs.
Incredible. I mean, you are really onto something, and you are thinking big.
So I'm thinking about instead of using
Hmm.
lift tanks to use these air bladders. And you can put them, both on the bottom and on the top and suspend this thing in the water column at a desired depth and hold these oysters in refrigerated wet storage without using any electricity. I've patented one of these and now I have a continuation in part, but you would have a minimum of 2 air bladders. So you would have a couple of
Right.
these on the bottom in a cage. Then you would have a section above that that holds your oysters. And then you'd have another cage on top with a single air bladder in the center. When you deflate all the air bladders, it's going to sit on the bottom, right? And when you inflate
Yep.
all of them, the oyster gear will emerge above the sea surface. And that way you can access it and move it. If you want to grow right at the surface,
Mm.
you deflate the underneath air bladders and it's suspended right at the surface by the top air bladder. Now that it's underwater, it only
Mm.
weighs a third as much as it does when it's completely out of the water. So now you can hold it up there. This is where oysters like to grow. You're out away from the predators and everything. But let's say you got a storm coming, you just evacuate this thing and it'll go down to the bottom. But let's just say you want to go into a thermocline where you can wet store. So now you evacuate
Yeah.
this top air bladder. The bottom ones are already evacuated, suspended from the surface. But instead of letting all the air out, letting it completely collapse, just let out enough that becomes a little heavier than neutrally buoyant. So now this thing weighs nothing. It's
Right.
suspended in the water column. And now you can take like a teeny buoy and hold it at the surface. And you can put a line on that if you want to go down 10 feet or 50 foot to hold it in a desired position. So now let's say you want to bring it back to the surface and it only takes a puff of air to bring it back up. which you could have a scuba
Yeah.
tank or something attached to it and do it remotely.
It sounds like the same concept as establishing neutral buoyancy as a scuba diver, and you can just basically suspend at any depth you want for as long as you can. And like you said, a tiny puff of air will change that and bring you back up.
And now, because you've got the stuff underneath it, you can bring it up and it becomes mobile. So this whole thing becomes transportable.
So I love the fact that the Shellevator create this vertical farming opportunity, which enables you to scale dramatically the volume, but also that it's horizontal in that you can drag it like a barge, I suppose, to a different location depending on the water quality or temperature or whatever factors are important to you.
Or to avoid harm, like a red tide. So red tide's coming, I might be closed
Right.
for months. So I would move the thing over to
Mhm.
Mississippi or something like that. So we have two different kinds. I have one that we call the shoreliner, and that's the barge style. And the entire surface is lift tank, and it's divided into at least 4 watertight, airtight lift tank compartments. And that you can move like 5 or 6 miles an hour. But I repurpose
Right.
pontoon boats, which we can tow those up to 20 miles an hour.
On the back of your Carolina
Right.
skiff, right?
And we call that the Shellevator Express.
It's
Yeah.
genius.
So where, you're probably only going to get 20 or 30,000 oysters on that one. But then you can take it up to a launch ramp and put it on a trailer and take it down the highway at 50 miles an hour. So you don't have to handle the bags at all.
Right.
One person can go out there with a
Yeah.
$150 blower, raise this thing up, disconnect, untie your bow lines or disconnect your carabiners, attach it to your bridle, go back to the ramp and pull this thing up on a trailer and go to your customer.
That's unbelievable. Is there anything similar to this that exists in the world today?
There's nothing like this in history. I mean, all of our agriculture has been very site specific. The only difference was when the Wild West was going on, we did cattle drives. So now we have something that could weigh 10 tons, could weigh 100 tons, but now you got 100,000 oysters. And you could park it until the conditions got better. They would have like some kind of propulsion steering system where you could either remote control them with your cell phone, or you can bring them up and have a tow vessel to move them around. So
Yeah.
there was just
Yeah.
as I look forward, I think, this will be the main source of protein on the planet by the end of my life.
I think it's going to be really interesting for other oyster farmers to hear this right from you and to hear how you've designed it and the ideas you have for it. It's really exciting. You are on the verge of something really big, and this is going to happen. It sounds like pretty imminently, which is amazing. It's fantastic.
We'll feed the planet and then we'll sequester
Yeah.
all the carbon.
I can't imagine there's anybody who could do this as well as you're going to be doing it. Well, Andy, I can't thank you enough for all the time you've given us and explaining these amazing inventions. The Shellevator sounds like the game changer, and the Reefers also these are two seemingly simple ideas that you can just tell conceptually are going to make a huge difference. So congratulations to you on coming up with those and the hard work you've put into it, and I can't wait to see what happens, and we'll be watching.
Kevin, I really appreciate you having me, and I can talk forever about Shellevators, as your listeners will probably tune me out, but
No, I don't think anybody's going to be tuning you out. It's way too interesting, but we'll just end it now and come back for more later. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Oyster-ology. Thanks so much to my guest, Andy DePaola, and his visionary ideas. Links to Andy's inventions are included in the show notes, complete with photos of some of his Shellevator prototypes, which really bring them to life, so check them out. And if you enjoyed this episode, please let me know in the comments and click to follow Oyster-ology on your favorite podcast platform. And please spread the word to anyone you think who may be interested so that they can listen in too. I'm your host, Kevin Cox. Join me next time as we pry open the shell of another interesting Oyster-ology topic.